All right. Well, last segment. Jesus and Mary Chain, not Jesus and Mary Chain, in case you were wondering. This is going to be one of our more interesting bios, guys, because I, while being familiar with the band, had no idea about the amount of intrigue in this band's story.
Okay.
So
Good.
this was a fun reference here. So the band was officially formed in Scotland.
Don't you want to do the
Oh, yeah, I need numbers.
music and the numbers?
Music and then numbers.
Okay. God, it's always...
You want to start
music,
over?
God forbid. Music and the... No, I'll do music and the numbers right
all
here.
being kept in.
It's one of those things I just get so excited, guys, that I steam right ahead into what we're going to cover. But yeah, I know that the song you're going to hear in the beginning of this segment is going to be Just Like Honey, and I put In a Hole in the montage. So yeah, here's Just Like Honey. And yeah, that is by far probably the most well-known song on this album. It's, I think, if you know Jesus and Mary Chain in their 80s work, they did have a minor hit in the US in the 90s, which we'll talk about. That's probably the song you're familiar with. Probably because of Lost in Translation, I'd say, is probably where a whole other generation of people would have probably discovered them for the first time. But anyway, let's go backwards, because I think it's important to know that the band was formed in Scotland in 1983.
Let's go to the numbers first, John.
God, I hate them. Can we just get rid of the numbers? I care less. Go ahead.
No, I like the numbers.
I like the numbers too.
I know you guys do, and I don't. I got voted out of this.
This is why we're doing it, John. There's rankings. This is how we're picking the albums. There's context here as well. So,
for the three people that give a shit about this, go ahead.
Well, two of them are here, so
yes, they are.
And so CHAIN-PSYCHOCANDY by the Jesus and Mary Chain comes in at number 37 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 5 in 1985, number 290 of all time. It is their highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and Jesus and Mary Chain comes in at number 215 of overall artist rankings in Best Ever Albums. So there you go, John. Now the floor is yours.
Thank
Scotland.
You, I appreciate it. Yes, Scotland, 1983. This is another one of these bands that they have the name, right, but only a couple pieces of it stay similar the entire time, which I feel is a trope of a lot of 80s bands. In this case, it is the dual songwriters for the band, the Reed brothers. That is William Reed, who does vocals, and Jim Reed, who is on the guitar. Interesting story. Neither Reed, while they were both songwriters, wanted to sing, so they actually flipped a coin because neither of them wanted to do it. And William Reed, I guess you could say, lost the coin toss by winning it, and thus became the singer of the band. So that is how that occurred. The other part of the classic lineup is Douglas Hart, who is the bassist. And for this album, Bobby Gillespie is on the drums. He would depart shortly after this album, which is their debut album, by the way, because he was also in the band Primal Scream, and he actually left to completely follow that muse after this. So he was gone within a year of this album being released. The original drummer was a gentleman by the name of Murray Dalglish, but he was quickly replaced by Bobby Gillespie on this album, and Bobby Gillespie on future albums would be replaced by a drum machine. Another hallmark of things that is like very 80s right there. So there you go. There's some stuff right off the bat. I sort of hedged on saying they were formed in Scotland in 1983 because how the story goes, from 1977 until 1982, the two Reed brothers largely spent their time on the dole, as they say, over the pond, right? Like collecting welfare. And basically during that time, they came up with the concept of the band, what they wanted to sound like, stuff like that. They were another band like heavily influenced by punk right around that 77 period. And then they sort of took that and over those 5 years decided how they wanted it to be fused. And sort of their vision as stated by them, was I think there's a clear 2-genre lane they're in, right? Which is sort of like the golden pop of like Brian Wilson and Phil Spector, right? Mixed with like the feedback and avant-garde nature of particularly the Velvet Underground and the Stooges was basically like what they considered their alchemy by their own admission, right? I think interestingly though, they had some other bands that they clearly name drop or other acts. Some you will definitely be able to tell. I think the most notable ones are like the Shangri-Las and Susie and the Banshees. I think, it's pretty clear how that goes. But they also mention Pink Floyd, Muddy Waters, and the Monkees as heavy influences on them, which I thought was a little bit more. Because up until that point, it's like Velvet Underground, Stooges, Brian Wilson, Phil Spector. Yeah, yes. Yeah, like, it's basically there. Like, okay. But yeah, I think it's also not surprising that this is considered one of the earliest entrees of what would later be called noise rock, which is described as guitar distortion, feedback, no traditional form in terms of chorus verse at times. There's some, but often goes away from it, and the guitar doesn't have solos or guitar parts, right? It just kind of is there. Also heavy echo, heavy reverb. Those are parts of it. Now it gets kind of interesting because there's a lot of intrigue around the band. The band at different points had the names The Poppy Seeds and Death of Joey before they settled on Jesus and Mary Chain. There isn't a really confirmed origin for the name. For a while, they were saying it was from a line from a Bing Crosby song, but then they pretty much admitted that they bullshitted that. There was a cereal giveaway that involved a chain of Jesus and Mary that sometimes that was a thing in England, and people think that might have been where it came from, but it hasn't really been totally confirmed. So such a distinctive name, but not a true origin story I could find, at least that had been confirmed by the band. They, like I said before, they kind of had an idea of what they wanted to be and sound like, and so they begin to record. And they rise to prominence a little bit, as much as this band rose to prominence, because this is very much like a Velvet Underground-y type thing, where like in their time they were certainly almost completely off the radar in the U.S. outside of the underground, and even in the U.K. they had some breakthroughs, but not nearly as much as contemporaries. They rise to prominence with a single called Upside Down in late 1984. It was released on a record label called Creation Records. They eventually end up, for this album, on the record label WEA. That's where they released Psycho Candy in 1985. One very important thing to know is that the Jesus and Mary Chain as a live act were quite the interesting live act, guys. And this, I'm not going to be able to do this justice, I don't think. They started because they had a hard time getting booked. They would show up at venues and say they were the opening band and kind of talk their way onto the stage. Now, you think to yourself, well, why was it so hard for them to get booked? Well, here is some of the things that were parts of their live set. Number one, they traditionally only played sets that were 20 to 25 minutes long, okay? They also did versions of their songs that had a more heavy emphasis on the noise element than any traditional structures. God. Okay. They played with their backs to the crowd, and they also most often played on amphetamines when they were on stage the entire time. And among things that they did often was their initial drummer, Dalglish, played a drum kit with 2 drums. William Reed would leave his guitar out of tune, and the bassist, Hart, started with a 3-string bass, but eventually he played a 2-string bass, and he attributed this alternately to cost cutting, as well as the fact that he really only used 2 of the strings anyway, so what the hell did he need the rest of them for, because he was working off of those. So those were all elements of the stage performance. They also were notably confrontational on the stage, which I found interesting since for a while they were playing with their back to the crowd. But apparently that didn't matter because they often had sets that ended with the the crowd being riled up because of the noise, but also because of the shortness of the set and sort of some of the things with it. And it would often lead to the people rushing the stage or throwing stuff and breaking the equipment. There were a lot of stories that a manager who was around them sort of was putting out, like, to kind of add intrigue to them, like that they stole money from a promoter's coat, which turned out to be untrue. They were kind of told to smash their instruments on Belgian TV, and then it became expected of them. So they started doing it, but that only further riled up the crowd. So a lot of their crowds, the descriptions I see are kind of like those hardcore crowds that we would read, where like the violence was an ominous specter, like all the time. And actually, eventually, even though it was reported in the British media that they had riots at their shows, they had never really had like a full-on riot until they had an actual real full-blown riot later on March 15th, 1985, when they played an overbooked venue. The first support band apparently was a real piece of work. Like, it was an openly antagonistic set with the crowd. There was a middle band that kind of things were able to stay calm, but then the Jesus and Mary Chain, in this highly charged environment, were an hour late between the second band and their performance. So there was an hour wait, at which point they played for 20 minutes before leaving the stage with no encore, which apparently was the Molotov cocktail that lit the violence and chaos. As you might imagine, with all of this going on around them, it was hard for them to be booked, especially in the United States. They actually were going to be the lead act for Sonic Youth in 1985 on a U.S. tour, but they kind of wanted to keep it under wraps because of their reputation, and it got leaked. And actually, the promoters and stuff were like, yeah, no thank you with these guys coming on. So they actually never were able to tour. That would have been quite the show. Jesus and Mary Chain and Sonic Youth in 1985. So yeah, that's a little bit of what's going on there. They do, as this is going on, they're touring, they do pretty quickly release a single called You Trip Me Up, and then the album CHAIN-PSYCHOCANDY was there in 1985. And it was relatively well regarded and well received in the UK. Very much flew under the radar in the US. And basically, after this album was released, CHAIN-PSYCHOCANDY, they took 2 years off, and as I mentioned before, Gillespie leaves to form the band Primal Scream, and of course, another band very influential in their own way. We'll talk and cover them later. And then they released a bunch of albums that did different things. They released an album called Darklands in 1987 that had a more traditional sound with their guitars. There still was feedback, but it kind of was looped a little bit more into what would be traditional structures of guitar playing. They did a singles and B-sides album that kind of sounded more like what we're covering tonight, called Barbed Wire Kisses in 1988. Then they did an album, Automatic, in 1989, which actually had both synthetic bass and drums instead of live and traditional drumming. They released an album in 1992 called Honey's Dead, which allowed them to end up on Lollapalooza, and then the bassist Hart leaves the band. They're sporadic in terms of producing albums. It's kind of just the Reed brothers, but they have released an album as recently as 2017. This is a band that kind of was just there for a long time and certainly influential on the music in the immediate aftermath of this and in the 90s, right? And all the way to the 2000s, 2010s as well. But they started to get like a little bit of a pop culture. They started showing up a lot in pop culture. They're in a Simpsons episode in season 24. As I mentioned before, Lost in Translation has a pretty famous scene, all the way to, I think, Scarlett Johansson sang on stage with them at Bonnaroo, which is kind of like hilarious and in like a meme type way, you know what I mean? Like the idea of like Scarlett Johansson in 2007 singing with an 80s retro act. It's too perfect for what like Bonnaroo is. And I'm sure the people that paid $1,500 for their ticket in their camper really enjoyed the authenticness of that performance. But yeah, Sublime has a song that references Jesus and Mary Chain. They're kind of all over the place, right? Like they end up being one of those groups. Matt, I know you love Pauly Shore. So Jesus and Mary Chain is featured in Encino Man as well, which I thought was interesting. Yeah. So yeah, they're kind of all over the place. Adventureland, the pretty cool film there. Yeah. Yep, movie has them in there as well. So yeah, that's a little bit of what it is. A very tumultuous band in terms of their live performance and their image. And I think a band that's going to be really interesting to talk about. So I think it's Matt who gets the first say on this one, right? And I can vividly remember a conversation we had way back when, Matt, when you turned me on to a band named the Ravenettes.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, gosh, it's a modern Jesus and Mary Chain. And you looked at me like I had two heads when I said that.
Yeah, because I didn't know.
Do you understand what I was going for there?
Oh,
Matt,
the first note off of this record, I was like, well, now I know where the Ravenettes come from. Yeah.
I just laughed. I was like, now Matt will finally know where that comment came from for me some 15 years ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also think it's funny that like I'm known as the I love Pauly Shore guy because I
just wanted to tag you with that, even though there's no factual basis in that comment. So yeah,
that guy. Talk about fascinating pop culture, people in their time. It's like, what was that about? But anyway, this is very much like, okay, Ravenettes, so it's interesting, hearing this album. And I love the Ravenettes, and I really like the combination that they and obviously Jesus and Mary Chain do here of, kind of really incorporating that really 50s doo-wop, like Phil Spector's Perfect, like all that, not even 50s, like 60s stuff, like talk about the Supremes and the Ronettes, that very, I think even like something they kick off these drum beats like that's just like that's the beginning of Be My Baby. It's like done.
Yeah, it's literally the beginning. They sample it. Yeah, pretty much sample it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, so the foundation of these songs is very much rooted in all of that type of stuff, and then you're just like, all right, now let's take the distortion and turn it up to 15, and just like and create sounds that are just like. It's noise, right? It's like, is this even music at a certain point? Because it's like, and it's. Are they even playing guitars, or are they just like pushing down a button and making this sound? Because it's just this like, talk about wall of sound. I mean, it's just this overbearing kind of like noise that's kind of coming through, but it's also kind of couched in this really beautiful melody. So it's also interesting. I find that the title of this album very interesting, "CHAIN-PSYCHOCANDY," because it's very much like I found myself, as the album went on, I was like it. In some ways, the album seems longer than it is. I mean, it's not even 40 minutes long. So, but it's almost like too much of a good thing after a while, because it's a hard thing to digest. This type of sound, because it's just so uncomfortable. Like just the same thing of like eating a bunch of. You don't want to you love candy. You don't want to eat a ton of it, right? Because then you get sick. And it's almost like, not that I was sick of the album, but I was losing interest, I think, as it went along, because I'm like, I get what you're doing, I like it. And there is some variety. I mean, there's some songs in here that are not as noisy, right? Like Cut Dead, Taste of Cindy, Sowing Seeds. I mean, these are kind of just like Honey. These are songs that are kind of, they turn it from 15 to they move it to 11, right? So they take the distortion. It's still very distorted, but it's also very much, they leave a little bit of space, whatever space that they can find.
Those are the songs where they're channeling the Velvet Underground. That's how I look at those songs. Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
And those are the ones that are probably like that they're easier to get into. It's not as in your face. So I do like that. That's not like all one note throughout the whole thing. I don't think that's what it is. But I mean, with 14 songs on here, and they're all relatively short, right? What's the longest? There's one song on here that's 4 minutes long. There's a couple that are in the 3s, and most of the rest of them are within the 2 minute range. So it's not like that, and it's good, right? You don't need to. These are not songs that really need to go much longer than that. But it's a really unique sound. I mean, I haven't heard anything really. We've heard the Velvet Underground, we've heard other experimental music, we've heard 60s pop, right? But we haven't heard it like in this incarnation. So this is clearly a new direction.
Well, the late 70s stuff and early 80s stuff we covered, some of the stuff that you guys found harder to listen to. I'll kind of get into that in mind.
Maybe I have to think back of that, but like maybe not to this level. I mean, maybe are you talking like more of like was this like Throbbing
Birthday Party?
Birthday
Throbbing
Party,
Gristle.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean some of that, but it's still, to me, this is still kind of different. But anyway, it is their own unique sound, right? and it is so funny that like what I heard, that like, yeah, this is the Ravenettes are, you're exactly right, Ravenettes 2.0, or the Ravenettes are Jesus and Mary Chain 2.0, I should say. So I did like it. And same with the Ravenettes. Like I have several of their albums, and I do like listening to them. But going back to it, there is something with some music like this that, like, when my initial reaction is like, oh my God, I love this. And then 5 songs later, I'm like, okay, it's still pretty good. And then like 4 songs later, I'm like, okay, I'm good. Like, I've had my fill. Actually, the first Ravenettes album that I had was their EP. I think it was like Attack of the Ghost Riders is the name of the EP, and it's like 5 songs, and I loved that. That was like the perfect length of this type of sound for me. And so when they translated to their fuller albums, maybe I wasn't as into them towards the end as much, but and I found it similar to this with this album here, but it's still a unique thing. It's still couched in melody, really, really good pop. But yeah, I think it's a little bit long, and it's kind of like at the end, I'm like, okay, I need a little bit of a palate cleanser. Like, this is not the type of music that I could, okay, now give me a Ravenettes. Like, let me hear the next thing like this. Like, this is something in dribs and drabs, or like, here and there. But when I'm into it, I do like it a lot. So yeah, I'm going to give it a slight thumbs up. Maybe even a full thumbs up, I would say. Like, it's just, I would say the only downside is like I would probably cut it a little bit shorter for me, because I think this could probably be just fine with as 8 or 9 tracks as it is with 14, and it would, in some ways, it would keep me wanting a little bit more, maybe, or maybe just being filled up enough. That's enough Psycho Candy for me. But thumbs up, yeah, it's still really cool. So I like it.
Well, confrontational is the perfect word for this album to my ears, because that was the journey I went on listening to this album. Velvet Underground is the thing that immediately came to mind. And I know, we kind of alluded to last show and before, like how I was going to take noise rock as a genre. And this album was extremely frustrating to me, because there are so many things I like about their kind of retro sound. It was clear to me that was what they were going for, and I really kind of like the songs underneath and the vibe that they're going for. But then depending on the amount of feedback that they put on the track is the amount that I either like or hate the song. And like Matt said, they kind of go all over the place with the there's varying levels of feedback that they add to the songs, and that's equivalent to the tracks that I enjoyed on this album. When the feedback and static is too much, like on songs like Taste the Floor, In a Hole, Inside Me, and when it gets to the point where it's like piercing, I'm like fully out on it, and I hate it, and I hate the band as a result, because I feel like they're trying to intentionally make me hate them, and trying to like push me away from liking their songs, or they're being confrontational by saying, hey, here's like a cool like retro vibe, but then we're gonna piss you off by like putting all of this stuff on top of it so you can't really hear it. And so when it's like that, it's hard for me to like a band fully. I guess that's kind of like a punk aesthetic in some ways, if they're really like fuck you to the crowd, and clearly like they liked riling the crowds up by some of the stories that John told in the bio. But the songs that I do like on Just Like Honey and Taste of Cindy and Never Understand and My Little Underground, those songs, they kind of do what I would say is like a tasteful amount of feedback, and so that you can still hear the song and enjoy kind of what their influences are. Sometimes the song feels like you're in the speaker, and that's how much feedback it is. Like I don't know, you're like in another world or something.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
And I just can't take it, and I find it hard to understand why someone would kind of enjoy that much feedback without kind of any musical variance. It's almost like, at times like you're listening to a radio that's staticky and getting drips and drabs of something. But I think other bands kind of do feedback better, or I hope they do. I think they kind of mess with it more and vary it and make it kind of more musical as a result. And so, or at least I'm hoping they do. I feel like some of the bands that we've heard so far kind of have done that, like Mission of Burma and stuff, and I like them more as a result. So this is firmly like thumbs in the middle, trending downward as a result. The other band that really kind of immediately came to mind that was probably influenced by them is Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. I feel like
that's a good one.
Their sound is definitely trying that retro sound with some feedback and stuff in it as well. So this was the definition of a frustrating album for me. I really wanted to like it more than I did, and I didn't have any expectations going in. I know we said it might be noise rock, but when I've heard that first song, I was like, Just Like Honey, I was like, oh, okay, this is really good. But then they kind of like progressively either pushed me away or kind of pulled me back in. So it's hard to get fully on board as a result. But that's kind of where I stand. So.
Gotcha. Well, I want to clean one stack, Matt, from earlier, because I was saying like bands we've listened to that have it. We said some, and I had mentioned The Birthday Party, which absolutely is the case. Suicide is the other one that is a clear reference point, I think, for these guys. Throbbing Gristle sounds nothing like these guys, though. They're actually kind of the exact opposite. So I just want to, somebody might be listening and go, what the heck? I know it's
I'm
a while back,
sometimes
but
kind of blurring some of these, these bands together that like, what was that sound again?
That's great that you said that, because I do feel like I'm starting to like occupy a lane that you got, like a box that you guys just aren't in with me, which is okay. But like there is like a aesthetic, I think, to some of the challenging rock that we're listening to that I feel like there might be some barriers with, but not in a bad, like you could basically take Josh's description of like what he didn't like about this album and like just reverse it, because that's like all the shit I like. Like it's basically aesthetically, it's highly appealing to me. And like, I like how it challenges me and diverts the song structure a little bit. And I love the fact that it is melodic enough. It's kind of like how the Velvets, right? Like at times, I remember way back when I listened to White Light, White Heat, and it was, I almost like would like to redo that album, because if I listen to my review of that now, I don't know if it would be anywhere near what it was, because like over time I just grew into like being able to trace that back to all of the stuff that I like. And I love the mix of the ominous and the saccharine sweet of the Phil Spector pop. I just love that juxtaposition. I never found this album too long, Matt. I found this in many ways like the perfect length in the deviations of what they did. I love the songs with the harsh feedback that kind of you sort of just float in the in the speaker is right, Josh, but like you sort of said it, I think, from a standpoint of in saying that, you're like, and this is why it's a challenge for me. For me, it's like, this is what I like. I like to put on the headphones and I like to like be blasted with that feedback sound and then see, it's almost like white noise. And then what comes around it stands out even more to me, because it's such a stark contrast. And that's where the pop coming in is like, whoa, listen to this, like, 60s pop, mixed under that, harsh sound, or even like, neutral white noise sound. And then I just really enjoy that. Feedback does not like turn me off, especially when it's like that static feedback that isn't just like feedback where it sounds like a guitar like screeching like one note, like nails on a chalkboard, right? Like if it's more steady and consistent, it's actually a pleasant sound for me in its own way, like almost like a cathartic sound for me. And I have like almost like an emotional connection to this type of music. And like I almost find that I write my own lyrics in my head to this sound because it evokes a feeling to me. And and like I said, the things that came about, obviously the intros we did, but it's kind of like I felt like Suicide kind of did what this did, in that it kind of gave the stories on top of the harsh sound, right? Which is what I liked about it. It was that, and in this case, the lyrics were a little bit more, I'm not gonna say nonsensical, but they didn't necessarily always add to the sound, because I felt like the music itself was the sound. And this is hugely influential, as we're gonna see in the late 80s and the 90s. I think you guys have both mentioned that it doesn't sound like a whole lot we've done in its own way. It does, and it like both doesn't and does. The merging of what it did doesn't, but like it absolutely is as much an antecedent of the Stooges and the Velvets and the Phil Spector pop sound, which we keep hearing. You know, Phil Spector's influence, right, is all over stuff we're listening to in the 70s and 80s as well, right? So, like, we have all of these pieces that we know. It's just the combination of bands that were feedback-driven and confrontational mixed with, you know, groups that were Phil Spector-driven. You rarely see them merge together. That's where I think the Velvets really are, and Lou Reed by himself, right, are really the only places that you're seeing that all the time, outside of, you know, the occasional Bowie song or, you know, different stuff like that. And I'm finding more and more that I like music that diverts from traditional chorus verse type of song structures, especially when, you know, I'm getting, you know, Tears for Fears and Phil Collins, and I'm not knocking those things, you know, Phil Collins, Tears for Fears, some of the pop music like Madonna and, you know, Michael Jackson are doing. Point, right? It like, you talk about a palate cleanser being the other stuff. It's funny because like, I feel like my palate cleanser is some of this more challenging stuff, as opposed to like the synthetic, you know, 80s pop, you know what I mean? Industrial / electronic type of music. And that's kind of where I stand. This is like an easy thumbs up for me. I really like this album. I've always really liked this album. But yeah, it will be very interesting because there aren't really barriers to this type of music for me, and there's like alternating barriers for you guys, and I'm just going to be interested to see if like there's stuff that transcends some of the like similarities, you know what I mean, like with how you're hearing this. That's kind of like what I talked about with the Pogues, right? Like there's like barriers to a certain type of music, but I was kind of with the Pogues able to like be able to identify like within that genre like what stood out, you know what I mean? And that's my goal for industrial, right? Like I've said from the beginning, like my goal is to figure out what represents my continuum in that type of music. And I'm just curious to see if I know that, Josh, you kind of come from the same spot that I do, and I know you're kind of operating from the same thing. I know, Matt, you're kind of more like, there's ice creams I like and ice creams I don't. And, like, that's where it's going to be interesting, I think. Like, is there deviation in it for you? Or is it just an ice cream you don't like, you know?
I mean, it seemed like you liked this album, Matt.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And it's like, that's what, and it's like, it seems like this version of it, right, is ice cream you like. But then there's other stuff that I think is similar to this that you're like, whoa, like, and that's where you're like, all of these bands that I didn't kind of know blend together. And I'm like, well, for me, Teardrop Explodes is very different than Throbbing Gristle is very different than Birthday Party. They're all avant-garde, but they're like avant-garde in different ways, right?
Oh,
whereas,
yeah.
Like,
no,
is it like
I
for
totally
you, like
agree
challenging
with that,
sometimes is like, its own ice cream, right?
But Teardrop Explodes, I didn't find that wasn't a challenging record at all.
No, I said avant. For some people, though, it would be. You know what I mean? It got because it's minimalist, right? You know, and
was it? I mean, it was very
a little bit. Maybe that's the wrong term for it. Maybe
I mean, they had a lot of instrumentation. They had horns and they had big hooks and catchy parts and stuff.
Fair point. Yeah.
They're in the similar lane of a band that I had no idea who they were. But I think that something like this, when you compare it to something like Birthday Party or like, you know what, Suicide was a good example because I totally see that, and I like this
Public
way
Image
more
Limited
than
was
Suicide.
Public Image Limited was one that I couldn't get over it, right? But it was because it was confrontational in like a highly electric format, and it was long. And I get it because like I've had ones where it's been like I can't meet this where it's at.
Yeah, and a lot of times for me, it's gonna come down to whether there's enough melody. Like if you're gonna do stuff like this, if there enough of a melody or like an interesting beat that keeps me interested.
But like, dude, some of this is gonna never have melody. It's the purpose of it is to be melodyless. That's what the music is. Well, some music, I'm saying, like some music is designed to be absent the melody.
I understand that. I'm not saying it. Of course I know that. I'm just saying, like, if you're gonna be an experimental band, right, and do like things that are confrontational or that are harsh or whatever you want to call it, like I'm gonna be okay with that if you hook me in somewhere, right? Like if it's just out there and there's like that's why I struggled with something like the pop group because I didn't really find much of that at all, you know. So, but something like this. Yeah, it might be for me a little bit long, like a shorter version of this, like, but is still enough for me to be like, yeah, this is cool. I like this. I could listen to this, you know. Right. But for me, it'd be better. I'm gonna like it more if it's peppered in with some other stuff. If it's not just this full blown for 40 minutes. And actually, I found that I forgot to mention this earlier, but I found this record to be one of the few albums that I think it was a disservice listening to it on headphones. Like listening to it on headphones did not enhance it was harder to listen to this with headphones because I wanted to turn it up because it's still got it. There's not a whole lot of bass here. It's a very, it's kind of another like tinny sound. There's not a lot of heft underneath what's happening as far as the bass goes. But turning it up, still was kind of harsher on my ears. It was hard. It was just harder to do that. I enjoyed this album better.
You can't cut through the noise, Matt. There's nothing you can do to get around that.
Right. I wanted to, but it was weird. I wanted to turn it up, but I didn't. It was this weird juxtaposition, and I found I like listening to this more in like a stereo or through the computer or whatever. So I found I found that more interesting.
I get it. I'm the total opposite. Like that's where it's like the pocket for me is on the headphones. Yeah.
But I imagine, and I'm not saying they do this, but I imagine a lot of bands use the feedback and the static as a crutch, and there's probably a lot of like bad noise rock compared to some other bands, and I just can imagine it being so easy to like hide your lack of musicianship or your inadequacies.
Well, it's not super easy to do this type of music. Yeah, it's hard to make feedback tame it, you know, like it's
well that's just my lack of knowledge then, because it seems
like
it would be something that would be easy to do.
You could totally, I mean, it's a
well, if you just did the screeching of the nails version of it, I totally get it. Like when somebody gets too close to the amp, but like to control it like this, like in this level requires a level of proficiency, right?
Yeah.
That would probably separate.
Because I would imagine too, it can be feedback and that type of thing can it's a quick thing that can get away from you, you know, if you don't tame it, you know what I mean? Because just think about guys, you know, sometimes they set up stages and stuff and it's like, whoa, the feedback, stop it. And they can't do it.
Well, every 90s band in their live performances would make sure to throw in a stand too close on purpose sound of it, you know, Nirvana famously, right? Like is who I always think of, like every time Kurt Cobain's getting some sort of like, you know, in the beginning before he like ramps in. That was like a hallmark of grunge, right? And that's done sort of for the aesthetic, right? Like to give it a little bit more edge. But yeah, if they were playing the whole time with the feedback, you know, darting in and out as opposed to sustained, and that's what it's really. This is sustained feedback, is what it is, and so it's like playing a guitar part in its own kind of weird, unique way. So,
Yep.
Cleaning of the stacks. They played that show with Scarlett Johansson at Coachella, not Bonnaroo.
Coachella, sorry.
I was at Bonnaroo 07. I don't remember Jesus and Mary Chain there. So
wrong corporate fest. Coachella's more the corporate fest than
way
Bonnaroo,
more in line than Bonnaroo's. Was still more in the jam band tradition at that time.
Apologize for disparaging Bonnaroo's good name with Coachella's. But
no, I always wanted clarification because I'm like, did I miss out on that? Because I don't remember that.
So I guess that's as good a place as any to stand. But I will say, get ready. My Bloody Valentine, Sonic Youth, Yola Tango. It's like
buckle in.
It ain't going away. Well, this type of music. Yep.
We saw Yola Tango live, and I did not feel like they were like this. So I don't know. But Maybe I'm misremembering.
Well, because you could, again, like a lot of different genres, you can still take like a noise rock, like the umbrella of noise rock, and do different things with it, right? And like I said, Suicide was a good example because that's very much kind of in line with this, and I didn't like that record at all.
Yeah.
You know, like I like all that stuff that you were talking about, the confrontational harshness of it. That was my experience with that, where this was, like, again, because it had enough melody here to keep me going. So.
Understood. No one's opinion is less valid than I mean. I like the fact that we're having strong opinions and we can agree to disagree on stuff. There is no right or wrong answer.
Hot takes.
Hot take. I find though, Josh, when you don't like an album, you are the hottest of all takes on this album. I find like
Josh doesn't hedge his bets.
He does not hedge his bets, which is okay. I like that. It kind of it gives no quarters. So yep.
And gives no fucks either.
I will say, Josh, if you want to hear what Yo La Tengo sounds like, listen to their cover of Little Honda by the Beach Boys.
Okay.
And tell me what you think.
Okay.
That's probably one that'll give you a little bit of a feel for, you
Yeah.
can already tell, right, when you're doing a Beach Boys song and what I consider
Yo
to be
La
a feedback
Tango
band.
also, just from my little knowledge of them, seems way more varied in their songs, like than this
Their
was.
influences.
Yeah. Well,
Later.
no, that's just this was
Later.
very much in that lane, but
Not
later Yo La
earlier.
Tango did that.
Later,
Okay.
yeah, not earlier. It's kind of like Sonic Youth, you know what I mean?
Got
It's
it.
like they've got like 5 different careers. So